The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty streets of Ouagadougou as Captain Ibrahim Traoré adjusted his military beret and stepped out of his armored vehicle. The 34-year-old Burkinabe officer had been making headlines across West Africa for months, but on this particular Tuesday in March, he was about to make a decision that would send shockwaves around the globe. Traoré's rise to power had been swift and unexpected. Just 8 months earlier, he had been a relatively unknown military captain, serving his country quietly while watching Burkina Faso struggle under the weight of jihadist insurgency and political instability. The former French colony had been bleeding for years, with terrorist attacks becoming almost routine occurrences in the northern regions. Villages were abandoned, schools closed, and families displaced as armed groups affiliated with Al-Qaeda and ISIS expanded their influence across the Sahel region. The previous government had relied heavily on French military support through Operation Barkhane, the massive counter-terrorism mission that had been France's primary tool for maintaining influence in its former African colonies. French troops, vehicles, and aircraft had become a common sight across Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger. But for many young Africans like Traoré, this foreign military presence felt more like continued colonialism than genuine assistance. Born in a small village outside the capital, Traoré had witnessed firsthand how foreign interventions often failed to address the root causes of instability. He had seen French soldiers patrol his homeland while local communities remained impoverished and marginalized. The disconnect between international promises of security and the daily reality of ordinary Burkinabe citizens had shaped his worldview from an early age. His military career began at the prestigious Military Academy of Kadiogo, where he quickly distinguished himself as a tactical thinker with unconventional ideas about warfare and governance. Unlike many of his contemporaries who viewed military service as a path to personal enrichment, Traoré seemed genuinely committed to serving his people. His fellow officers often remarked on his unusual habit of spending weekends in rural villages, listening to farmers and herders discuss their security concerns. The turning point came in September, when Traoré led a group of young officers in overthrowing the military government that had itself seized power just months earlier. The coup was swift and bloodless, with Traoré emerging as the leader of the patriotic movement for safeguard and restoration. At his first press conference as head of state, he made it clear that his government would pursue a radically different approach to both security and international relations. Western diplomats in Ouagadougou initially dismissed Traoré as another young African military leader who would eventually fall in line with established international norms. The French embassy continued operating normally, assuming that, like previous Burkinabe leaders, Traoré would eventually recognize his country's need for French security assistance. American officials viewed him as potentially manageable, perhaps even useful for their own counter-terrorism objectives in the region. But Traoré had been quietly building relationships with non-Western partners. Russian military advisors had begun arriving in neighboring Mali, offering equipment and training without the political conditions typically attached to Western aid. China had been expanding its economic footprint across West Africa, providing infrastructure investments without lectures about democracy and human rights. These alternatives to traditional Western partnerships were becoming increasingly attractive to African leaders seeking greater autonomy. The intelligence reports reaching Traoré's desk painted a concerning picture of continued foreign military activities on Burkinabe soil. French reconnaissance flights were monitoring government communications, and there were credible reports of unauthorized intelligence-gathering operations. Some of his advisors suspected that certain recent jihadist attacks had been timed to coincide with political developments, raising questions about whether foreign actors were manipulating the security situation to maintain their influence. Traoré's inner circle consisted of young, educated officers who had grown up during the era of social media and global connectivity. They were acutely aware of liberation movements in other parts of the world and drew inspiration from leaders who had successfully challenged foreign domination. They studied the strategies used by Vietnam, Cuba, and more recently, countries like Syria and Afghanistan to resist foreign intervention. The breaking point came when French military aircraft conducted what they claimed was a routine counter-terrorism operation in northern Burkina Faso, without coordinating with the new government. Traoré viewed this as a deliberate provocation and a clear violation of his country's sovereignty. His military commanders were furious and pressure was mounting for a strong response. Late one evening, as Traoré sat in his office reviewing intelligence briefings, his chief of staff entered with urgent news. Satellite imagery had detected unusual French military movements near the border with Mali. Convoys of vehicles and aircraft were positioning themselves in what appeared to be preparation for a larger operation. The timing seemed particularly suspicious, coming just days after Traoré had announced his intention to review all foreign military agreements. That night, Traoré made several encrypted phone calls to contacts in Moscow, Beijing, and Tehran. The conversations were brief but significant. By dawn, he had received assurances of political and potentially military support if his government chose to take decisive action against what he viewed as foreign aggression. The young leader spent hours walking through the presidential compound, weighing his options. He knew that any aggressive move against French forces would trigger a massive international response. Western media would condemn him as a dictator, threatening regional stability. Sanctions would follow, and his country's already struggling economy would face severe pressure. But Traoré also understood that backing down would signal weakness to both his own military and the broader African audience that was watching his government closely. Across the continent, young Africans were demanding leaders who would stand up to foreign domination. The Arab Spring had shown how quickly popular movements could emerge when people felt their dignity was being respected. As he prepared for what would become the most consequential decision of his leadership, Traoré reflected on a conversation he had with his grandmother years earlier. She had lived through the independence struggle and often told him stories about the sacrifices required to achieve true freedom. Her words echoed in his mind as he finalized the orders that would change everything. The secure communications room in the presidential palace buzzed with nervous energy as Traoré's top military advisors gathered around the large tactical display screen. Colonel Amina Sawadogo, his defense minister, and one of the few women in Bayeux, his inner circle, had just finished briefing the team on French military positions across the country. The intelligence was startling in its detail, revealing a network of surveillance operations that extended far beyond what the previous government had been aware of. Major Ousmane Kabore, Traoré's chief intelligence officer, had spent weeks documenting French activities using a combination of local informants and sophisticated electronic monitoring equipment recently acquired from Eastern European suppliers. The evidence showed regular flights by French surveillance aircraft over government installations, unauthorized communications intercepts, and what appeared to be coordination with certain opposition groups within the country. The most troubling discovery was a French military compound near Kaya, in the country's north-central region that was operating far beyond its official mandate. Satellite imagery revealed construction of permanent facilities, weapons storage areas, and communications equipment that suggested long-term strategic positioning rather than temporary counter-terrorism support. Local villagers reported seeing unmarked vehicles and personnel conducting nighttime operations in the area. Traoré studied the intelligence reports with growing determination. His government had repeatedly requested information about French military activities from the ambassador, but responses had been vague and dismissive. It was becoming clear that France viewed Burkina Faso not as a sovereign partner, but as a client state where French interests took precedence over local authority. The international context was also shifting dramatically. In neighboring Mali, the military government had recently expelled French forces and invited Russian Wagner Group contractors to provide security assistance. Niger was experiencing similar tensions, with growing anti-French sentiment among young people who viewed the former colonial power as an obstacle to genuine independence. Across West Africa, a new generation of leaders was emerging with very different attitudes toward foreign military presence. Traoré's communications with other African leaders had revealed a shared frustration with Western condescension and interference. During a recent African Union meeting, several heads of state had privately expressed support for more assertive approaches to dealing with foreign military presence. The mood across the continent was shifting, and Traoré sensed an opportunity to position Burkina Faso as a leader in this new wave of African independence. His military commanders were eager for action. Many had trained alongside French forces and felt personally betrayed by what they saw as surveillance and manipulation operations. Captain Razak Ouedraogo, who commanded the country's small but capable drone unit, had been particularly vocal about the need to demonstrate Burkina Faso's willingness to defend its sovereignty. The drone program had been one of Traoré's earliest investments as leader. Rather than relying entirely on expensive Western military equipment, he had pursued partnerships with countries like Turkey, Iran, and China to develop indigenous capabilities. The Turkish-made Bayraktar drones had proven particularly effective in previous operations against jihadist groups, and Traoré believed they could serve a broader strategic purpose. As the meeting progressed, Traoré outlined his strategy for what he called Operation Dignity. The plan was designed to send a clear message about Burkina Faso's sovereignty while minimizing the risk of casualties that could provoke a massive retaliation. The target would be carefully chosen to maximize symbolic impact while avoiding direct confrontation with French personnel. Intelligence had identified a French reconnaissance aircraft that regularly conducted unauthorized flights over government facilities. The plane, a modified transport aircraft equipped with sophisticated surveillance equipment, operated from a base in neighboring Ivory Coast, but frequently violated Burkinabe airspace. Its flight patterns suggested it was gathering intelligence on government communications and military positions. Colonel Ouedraogo raised concerns about the international legal implications of targeting French military assets. She worried that such action could be portrayed as terrorism or unprovoked aggression, potentially isolating Burkina Faso diplomatically and economically. The discussion that followed was intense, with various advisors presenting different scenarios and potential consequences. Major Caboret argued that international law actually supported their position. The French aircraft was conducting surveillance operations without permission from the sovereign government, which constituted a clear violation of international norms. He cited precedents from other countries that had taken military action against unauthorized foreign surveillance activities. Traoré listened carefully to all perspectives before making his decision. He understood the risks, but believed that the greater danger lay in allowing foreign powers to operate with impunity on Burkinabe territory. His government's legitimacy depended partly on its ability to demonstrate effective sovereignty, and passive acceptance of foreign surveillance would undermine that credibility. The technical preparations for the operation began immediately. Captain Ouedraogo's drone operators had been tracking French aircraft movements for weeks, developing detailed understanding of flight patterns and communication protocols. They had identified several opportunities when surveillance aircraft would be vulnerable to interception while operating in clearly Burkinabe airspace. Communications security became paramount as the operation moved forward. Traoré's government had learned from the experiences of other countries that had faced Western intelligence operations. All planning discussions were conducted in secure facilities with electronic countermeasures, and information was compartmentalized to prevent leaks that could compromise the mission. Meanwhile, Traoré began reaching out to international partners who might provide political support if the operation succeeded. Russian officials expressed private encouragement for African countries asserting their sovereignty. Chinese diplomats indicated that Beijing would support Burkina Faso's right to defend its territorial integrity. Even some traditional Western allies privately acknowledged that French surveillance activities raised legitimate concerns about sovereignty. The propaganda dimension was also carefully planned. Traoré's media advisors prepared materials that would frame the operation as a legitimate defense of national sovereignty rather than an aggressive act. They gathered documentation of unauthorized French activities and legal justifications for defensive action. The goal was to control the narrative from the moment the operation became public. As the final preparations continued, Traoré spent increasing time in communication with military commanders in other West African countries. The response to his planned action would likely influence similar decisions across the region, and he wanted to ensure coordination with sympathetic governments. The evening before the operation, Traoré addressed his senior staff one final time. He reminded them that their actions would be judged by history and that they had an opportunity to demonstrate that African countries could defend their sovereignty against any form of foreign domination. The room was silent as he concluded his remarks and authorized the operation to proceed. Dawn broke over the remote drone operations center located in a converted warehouse outside Ouagadougou. Captain Razak Ouedraogo had barely slept, spending most of the night reviewing flight plans and double-checking equipment calibrations. His team of 6 drone operators represented the elite of Burkina Faso's newly developed unmanned aircraft capabilities, each hand-picked for their technical skills and unwavering loyalty to the government. The operations center itself was a testament to Traoré's vision of technological independence. Rather than relying solely on Western suppliers who could potentially sabotage or monitor their equipment, the government had assembled systems from multiple sources. Turkish Bayraktar TB2 drones formed the backbone of the fleet, supplemented by Chinese communications equipment and locally manufactured modifications that enhanced their capabilities. Intelligence reports indicated that the French surveillance aircraft, designated Falcon Eye by Traoré's forces, would begin its regular reconnaissance mission at approximately 800 hours. The aircraft typically crossed into Burkinabe airspace near the town of Dori, before conducting systematic surveillance of government and military facilities across the northern regions. Today's flight pattern would take it directly over several sensitive installations. Traoré arrived at the operations center just as the technical preparations were being finalized. He had spent the early morning hours in encrypted communications with supportive governments, ensuring that the international response would not catch his administration unprepared. Russia had positioned diplomatic teams to provide immediate political support, while China had quietly indicated that it would block any attempt to condemn Burkina Faso at the United Nations Security Council. The psychological pressure on the Yari drone operators was immense. They understood that their actions would likely trigger the most serious international crisis in their country's recent history. Captain Ouedraogo addressed his team one final time, reminding them that they were defending their homeland's sovereignty and that future generations of Burkinabe citizens would judge their courage on this day. At 07:45 hours, radar operators detected the French aircraft departing from its base in neighboring Ivory Coast. The plane's flight path was consistent with previous surveillance missions, suggesting that French forces had no indication of the impending interception. Communications intercepts revealed normal operational chatter between the aircraft crew and their command center, with no apparent awareness of Burkina Faso's preparation. Traoré positioned himself directly behind the lead drone operator, Lieutenant Fatimata Compaoré, one of the most skilled pilots in the unit. Her steady hands and calm demeanor under pressure had made her the obvious choice for this historic mission. As the French aircraft approached Burkinabe airspace, she began final systems checks on the armed Bayraktar drone designated for the intercept mission. The weapon selected for the operation was a Turkish-manufactured MAML precision-guided munition, specifically designed for surgical strikes with minimal collateral damage. The missile's advanced guidance system could distinguish between different parts of an aircraft, allowing operators to target specific sections like engines or communication equipment rather than completely destroying the target. At exactly 08:03 hours, the French surveillance aircraft crossed into Burkinabe airspace without authorization. Air traffic control at Ouagadougou Airport had received no flight plan or coordination request from French authorities, confirming the illegal nature of the incursion. Major Caboret immediately documented the violation with time-stamped radar, imagery, and radio communications records. Lieutenant Compaoré launched the interceptor drone at 08:05 hours, with the unmanned aircraft climbing rapidly toward the altitude of the French surveillance plane. The Bayraktar's advanced sensors quickly acquired the target, providing high-resolution imagery that confirmed the aircraft's identity and surveillance equipment configuration. Everything was proceeding according to plan. The French crew appeared to detect the approaching drone at 08:12 hours, based on sudden changes in their flight pattern and increased radio communications. However, their aircraft was not designed for evasive maneuvers, and the surveillance equipment made it difficult to take defensive action. The crew's training had focused on intelligence gathering rather than air-to-air combat situations. Traoré watched the real-time video feed as the drone closed to firing range. The moment required split-second decision-making, as the French aircraft was attempting to accelerate toward the border with neighboring Mali. Once it crossed into Malian airspace, the legal justification for the intercept would become more complicated, potentially providing ammunition for international critics. The authorization to fire came at 08:14 hours. Lieutenant Compaoré's training took over as she guided the precision munition toward the French aircraft's left engine. The strike was executed with remarkable accuracy, disabling the surveillance plane without causing fatal damage to the crew. Smoke began streaming from the damaged engine as the aircraft initiated emergency procedures. French radio communications immediately shifted to distress frequencies as the crew declared an in-flight emergency. Their aircraft was losing altitude and experiencing significant systems failures, but remained controllable enough for an emergency landing attempt. Ground control in Ivory Coast scrambled rescue helicopters and alerted medical facilities along the aircraft's projected flight path. The damaged surveillance plane managed to reach a small airfield in northern Ivory Coast, where it executed a successful emergency landing despite considerable damage to its left wing and engine. The crew of 4 French military personnel survived the incident with minor injuries, though their expensive surveillance equipment was completely destroyed. In the forced landing, within minutes of the strike, Traoré's government activated its prepared media strategy. State television interrupted regular programming to broadcast a statement from the president, explaining the action as a legitimate defense of national sovereignty. The broadcast included radar imagery showing the unauthorized intrusion into Burkina Bay, airspace, and documentation of previous violations by French military aircraft. The international reaction was swift and explosive. The French embassy in Ouagadougou immediately contacted the foreign ministry, demanding an explanation and threatening serious consequences for what they characterized as an unprovoked attack on French military personnel. Ambassador Marie-Claire Dubois requested an emergency meeting with Traoré, her tone suggesting that France viewed the incident as an act of war. News agencies around the world picked up the story within hours, with initial reports focusing on the dramatic nature of an African country shooting down a French military aircraft. Social media exploded with commentary from across the political spectrum, with some celebrating Traoré's boldness, while others condemned what they saw as dangerous escalation. Captain Ouedraogo's operators maintained their positions as international pressure mounted. They had successfully demonstrated Burkina Faso's capability to defend its airspace, but everyone understood that the most challenging phase of the crisis was just beginning. The world was watching to see how France would respond to this unprecedented challenge to its military presence in West Africa. Traoré remained in the operations center as encrypted messages arrived from capitals around the world. The carefully planned operation had succeeded tactically, but its ultimate success would depend on the political and diplomatic battle that was about to unfold on the international stage. The Élysée Palace in Paris erupted into controlled chaos as news of the drone strike reached President Emmanuel Macron during his morning briefing. Defense Minister Sébastien Lecornu had rushed into the presidential office with preliminary reports from military commanders in West Africa, his face grim with the implications of what had just occurred. For the first time since independence, a former French colony had successfully engaged French military assets in combat. Macron's initial reaction was disbelief, followed quickly by anger. The idea that Burkina Faso, a country heavily dependent on French security assistance, would dare attack French military personnel seemed inconceivable. His advisors scrambled to gather more details while the president paced his office, demanding immediate options for response. The political ramifications were staggering, with potential impacts on France's entire Africa policy. Within the French military establishment, the news generated shock and urgent strategic discussions. General François Lecointre, Chief of Defense, staff convened an emergency meeting at the Ministry of Defense, as reports confirmed that the surveillance aircraft had been deliberately targeted by Burkina Bay forces. Intelligence analysts worked frantically to understand how Traoré's government had acquired the capability to conduct such a precise strike. The immediate priority was medical attention for the crew of the downed aircraft. French military personnel, At the emergency landing site confirmed that all 4 crew members had survived, though 2 required hospitalization for injuries sustained during the forced landing. The surveillance equipment, worth millions of euros and containing highly sensitive intelligence capabilities, was completely destroyed and would need to be secured to prevent technological secrets from falling into hostile hands. French media coverage began within hours of the incident, with major news outlets struggling to explain how a small African nation had successfully challenged French military superiority. Le Figaro's headline read, "Unprecedented attack on French forces in Africa," while Le Monde focused on the broader implications for France's regional security strategy. Television news programs featured military experts attempting to analyze the technical and political dimensions of the crisis. The broader European response developed throughout the day, as France briefed its NATO allies on the situation. Germany and the United Kingdom expressed solidarity with France while privately questioning whether French Africa policy had contributed to the escalation. European Union officials called for restraint from all parties while supporting France's right to defend its military personnel. Back in Ouagadougou, Traoré's government monitored international reactions with a mixture of satisfaction and apprehension. The president's communication team had prepared for various scenarios, but the intensity of global attention exceeded their expectations. State television continued broadcasting documentaries about colonial history and foreign military interference, seeking to frame the drone strike within a broader narrative of African liberation. Russian officials were among the first to publicly support Burkina Faso's actions. Foreign Ministry spokesman Dmitry Peskov told reporters that Russia understood the country's need to defend its sovereignty against unauthorized foreign military activities. The statement was carefully worded to avoid directly condemning France, while expressing support for African nations' right to control their own airspace. Chinese Foreign Ministry spokeswoman Mao Ning echoed similar themes during her regular press briefing in Beijing, stating that all countries had the right to protect their territorial integrity and that foreign military activities should be conducted with proper authorization from sovereign governments. While not explicitly endorsing the drone strike, China's statement clearly supported the principle underlying Traoré's decision. American officials found themselves in a diplomatically awkward position. The United States maintained strong alliance relationships with France while also conducting its own counterterrorism operations across West Africa. Secretary of State Antony Blinken's initial statement called for de-escalation, while avoiding criticism of either party, reflecting Washington's complex interests in the region. The African Union headquarters in Addis Ababa became a focal point for continental reactions to the crisis. Several member states quietly expressed admiration for Traoré's boldness, though official statements remained cautious due to concerns about encouraging similar confrontations. South Africa's government called for dialogue between all parties, while Nigeria emphasized the importance of respecting sovereignty and international law. Social media platforms exploded with reactions from across Africa and the global South. Hashtags like Queer African Sovereignty and the Traoré strikes began trending as young Africans celebrated what they saw as a historic moment of resistance against neo-colonialism. Videos of Traoré's speeches were shared millions of times, with many users comparing him to legendary independence leaders like Patrice Lumumba and Thomas Sankara. The economic implications of the crisis began emerging as international markets reacted to the potential for broader instability in West Africa. French companies with operations in Burkina Faso and neighboring countries saw their stock prices decline as investors worried about the security of their investments. Gold mining operations, which formed a significant part of the regional economy, temporarily suspended some activities pending clarity on the security situation. French military planners worked through the night developing response options for President Macron's consideration. The choices ranged from diplomatic pressure and economic sanctions to various levels of military retaliation. Each option carried significant risks, as any aggressive response could trigger broader anti-French movements across West Africa, while passive acceptance could encourage similar actions by other African governments. Intelligence assessments revealed the sophisticated nature of Traoré's planning and preparation for the crisis. French analysts had underestimated his government's technical capabilities and international support network. The precision of the drone strike and the coordinated media response suggested months of careful preparation with assistance from experienced military advisors, likely from Russia or China. Burkina Faso's diplomatic missions around the world activated crisis communication protocols, briefing foreign governments on their perspective of events. Ambassador to the United Nations Dieudonné Désiré Sougouri prepared for emergency sessions where the incident would likely be discussed. The government's legal team compiled documentation supporting their position under international law regarding territorial violations and self-defense. Regional security implications became increasingly apparent as neighboring countries reassessed their own relationships with France. Mali's military government issued a statement supporting Burkina Faso's right to defend its sovereignty, while Niger's leadership remained publicly neutral, but privately expressed understanding for Traoré's position. The incident threatened to accelerate the broader shift away from French security partnerships across the Sahel region. International humanitarian organizations expressed concern about the potential for escalating conflict to disrupt aid operations and worsen the already precarious security situation in West Africa. The United Nations called for immediate dialogue between France and Burkina Faso to prevent further deterioration of the situation. As the first day of the crisis concluded, it became clear that Traoré's drone strike had fundamentally altered the dynamics of France-Africa relations. The young Burkinabe leader had successfully challenged French military presence in a way that previous African leaders had never attempted. The question now was whether his gamble would inspire broader continental transformation or trigger devastating retaliation that could destroy his government's ambitious vision for African independence. The United Nations Security Council chamber in New York filled with tension as diplomats from around the world gathered for an emergency session requested by France. Ambassador Nicolas de Rivière took his seat at the French delegation table, carrying detailed briefing materials about what his government characterized as an unprovoked attack on French military personnel, conducting legitimate counterterrorism operations in West Africa. The session opened with Secretary General Antonio Guterres calling for restraint from all parties while expressing concern about the potential for broader regional instability. His statement carefully avoided taking sides in the dispute, reflecting the complex political dynamics within the UN system, where many member states harbored their own grievances against former colonial powers. Ambassador de Rivière's presentation lasted nearly 30 minutes, during which he outlined France's version of events and demanded international condemnation of what he termed an act of state terrorism by Burkina Faso's government. He displayed photographs of the damaged surveillance aircraft and medical reports on the injured crew members, seeking to build support for strong action against Traoré's administration. The Russian representative, Ambassador Vasily Nebenzia, challenged France's narrative from the outset. He questioned why French military aircraft were conducting surveillance operations over Burkina Faso without authorization from the sovereign government, suggesting that France itself had violated international law. His intervention signaled Russia's intention to use the crisis as an opportunity to challenge Western influence in Africa. China's ambassador Zhang Jun supported Russia's position with a more measured tone, emphasizing the importance of respecting sovereignty and obtaining proper authorization for foreign military activities. While not explicitly endorsing the drone strike, his statement clearly implied that Burkina Faso had legitimate grievances about unauthorized French operations on its territory. The African group at the United Nations found itself in a delicate position. Many member states privately supported Traoré's assertion of sovereignty, but feared the precedent of endorsing military action against foreign forces. South Africa's ambassador attempted to chart a middle course, calling for dialogue while acknowledging the legitimate concerns about unauthorized military activities. Meanwhile, demonstrations erupted across major African cities as news of the AI drone strike spread through social media networks. In Dakar, Lagos, Nairobi, and Johannesburg, young protesters gathered outside French embassies chanting slogans supporting Traoré and demanding an end to foreign military presence in Africa. The protests were largely peaceful, but demonstrated the significant popular support for Burkina Faso's actions. French President Macron faced mounting pressure from his own political establishment to respond decisively to the crisis. Right-wing Politicians accused him of weakness in allowing a small African nation to humiliate France with impunity. Marine Le Pen's National Rally Party organized demonstrations demanding military retaliation, while left-wing critics questioned the wisdom of maintaining extensive military commitments across Africa. The European Union struggled to develop a unified response to the crisis. While member states generally supported France's position, several countries privately questioned whether French military activities in Africa had become counterproductive. Germany and Italy, facing their own challenges with migration from Africa, worried that escalating tensions could worsen regional stability and increase refugee flows toward Europe. American officials worked behind the scenes to prevent the crisis from escalating into broader regional conflict. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan conducted urgent consultations with French counterparts while also reaching out to African leaders who might influence Traoré's decision-making. The Biden administration feared that military confrontation could provide opportunities for terrorist groups and rival powers to expand their influence in West Africa. Intelligence agencies across the Western world scrambled to understand how Burkina Faso had acquired the capability to conduct such a sophisticated operation. Preliminary assessments suggested extensive foreign assistance in planning and equipment, with particular attention focused on potential Russian or Chinese involvement. The implications for Western counterterrorism operations across Africa were significant if other countries developed similar capabilities. Traoré's government maintained its defiant position, despite growing international pressure. In a televised address to the nation, the president explained his decision-making process and challenged critics to explain why former colonial powers should be allowed to operate military forces across Africa without local consent. His speech was broadcast live across social media platforms, reaching millions of viewers beyond Burkina Faso's borders. Economic pressure began building as France implemented targeted sanctions against key figures in Traoré's government. Bank accounts were frozen, travel restrictions imposed, and French companies operating in Burkina Faso received guidance about potential risks to their operations. However, alternative economic partnerships with Russia and China provided some buffer against Western economic coercion. The crisis created new opportunities for non-Western powers to expand their influence in Africa. Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov announced plans for a major diplomatic tour of West African countries, while Chinese officials accelerated negotiations on infrastructure projects that could reduce African dependence on Western partners. The drone strike had opened space for a significant geopolitical realignment in the region. Military analysts around the world studied the technical aspects of Burkina Faso's operation, seeking to understand the implications for future conflicts. The precision of the strike and the sophisticated nature of the overall campaign suggested that smaller nations could potentially challenge major powers using asymmetric warfare tactics and advanced technology. Regional security arrangements across West Africa came under intense scrutiny as other countries reassessed their relationships with France. The Economic Community of West African States, ECOWAS, faced pressure to take a position on the crisis, but member states were deeply divided between those supporting French engagement and others sympathizing with Burkina Faso's assertion of sovereignty. Humanitarian organizations expressed growing concern about the impact of political tensions on their operations across the Sahel region. Many aid programs depended on French military protection, and the crisis threatened to disrupt critical assistance to millions of people affected by conflict and climate change. The potential for broader instability raised fears of a humanitarian catastrophe. International legal experts debated the legitimacy of both sides' actions under international law. While France argued that its surveillance activities were justified by counterterrorism agreements, Burkina Faso maintained that unauthorized military operations violated its sovereignty. The dispute highlighted broader questions about the legal framework governing foreign military interventions in Africa. As the crisis entered its third day, both sides faced critical decisions about how far they were willing to escalate the confrontation. France needed to demonstrate that attacks on its military forces would have consequences, while Traoré's government sought to maintain international support for its position without triggering devastating retaliation. The world watched nervously, as two fundamentally different visions of Africa's future collided on the international stage. 6 months after the drone strike that shocked the world, Captain Ibrahim Traoré stood before the African Union Summit in Addis Ababa as one of the most influential leaders on the continent. The crisis that had begun with a single precision missile had fundamentally transformed not only Burkina Faso's international position, but the entire landscape of Africa-Europe relations. The young leader, who had once been dismissed as another military upstart, was now being hailed as a visionary who had catalyzed a continent-wide awakening. The immediate aftermath of the drone strike had been tense and uncertain. France's initial response had been swift economic sanctions and diplomatic pressure, with President Macron demanding international isolation of Traoré's government. However, the anticipated military retaliation never materialized as French officials gradually recognized the sophisticated nature of their opponent's preparation and the significant international support he had cultivated. The turning point came when 3 other West African nations announced their intention to review their military agreements with France. Mali's government, emboldened by Traoré's example, accelerated the expulsion of French forces and invited Russian contractors to fill the security vacuum. Niger followed suit within weeks, while even traditionally pro-French countries like Senegal began demanding greater oversight of foreign military activities on their territory. The ripple effects extended far beyond military arrangements. Across Africa, a new generation of leaders emerged who explicitly rejected what they termed the colonial mentality that had governed the continent's